If Brexit was having a big negative impact, then we would have fallen well behind France. And the key point is that hasn't happened.
So what's remarkable, I think, is how unremarkable UK growth is relative to other countries, other big countries in Europe. And I think it's not really credible to conclude that there was an 8% reduction in GDP from leaving the EU.
I think, frankly, they fail at a basic smell test. The numbers are too big.
When we look at the raw data, conclude if there was an effect, it was not very large.
I'm sceptical of any modelling that comes up with a really big number, because it just doesn't seem to fit the facts, the reality on the ground.
And so the idea that there's been some catastrophic impact of Brexit isn't really credible. Exports have increased by about 23% in total to both the EU and non-EU. So the idea that the UK might have seen a 15% drop in trade hasn't been borne out.
What we're seeing is actually business investment has done pretty well over the last few years. It seems to be back on track.
Trade to the European Union has not collapsed. Not only is it not collapsed, it's actually increased in real terms.
So the new mayor of the City of London has said, it's very important to not to move back towards copying EU regulations. We're doing much better outside.
We no longer pay 20 billion or so pounds to the European Union each year. We will henceforward be paying a significant sum of money for the privilege of agreeing to follow their rules without having any say on how those rules are set.
Repeated enough times, and the most fanciful propaganda becomes incontestable public fact. We all know Brexit has been a terrible disaster, don't we? That it's caused huge trade losses, sky-high inflation, and has indeed shrunk the UK economy by 4% overall. Or is it 4% a year? Or apparently now 8% a year? The problem is not a single one of the above statements is true, or even close to being true. Looking at actual real-world economic data rather than the creative modelling games employed by Remain activists, Brexit appears to have had remarkably little negative effects on the British economy, and we have performed better than many European economies. But more importantly, this drip feed of propaganda is being used by the government to pull Britain back into the EU's sluggish and restrictive orbit. Lies matter, and to debunk a whole host of them, I'm joined today by two leading economists, Julian Jessop and David Paton. Julian is an economist with almost 4 decades of experience in the public sector, in the city and in consultancy. He publishes extensively, and he's also the economics fellow for the Institute for Economic Affairs, and previously he was their chief economist. David is an economist and a professor at the University of Nottingham Business School in industrial economy. He is also the editor of the International Journal of the Economics of Business, and as well as that, he's got much experience as an advisor to the government, having worked for the HM Revenue and Customs, the Department of Culture, Media and Sports, and the Department of Trade and Industry. They're also seasoned media performers, including on the BBC, so I'm delighted we have their expertise today. Welcome, gentlemen. This is an area, of course, which has been highly contentious, and there's been so much messaging about the negatives of Brexit that I'm so glad that you're here to help our viewers and help me understand why so many of these accusations are myths, and to basically provide the counter-arguments to show that Brexit hasn't been the catastrophe that we're often told that it is. Of course, we know that the Remain campaign love their modelling and their hypotheticals and their predictions. In fact, Project Fear was the core element of that was predictions, and we had some remarkable claims made that there would be an immediate recession after a Brexit vote. There would be a huge drop in the GDP, a huge spike in unemployment, and that, of course, we would have a punishing emergency budget with 30 billion of tax tax cuts and of tax rises rather, and public spending cuts. None of those came to fruition. But more recently, we have had these claims continue that Brexit has been a disaster. So let's jump right into this now, if we can, Julian. GDP has been one of the big issues of discussion. We are now 10 years after the Brexit vote. So what can you tell us about the state of Britain's GDP?
Well, first of all, you're right to say that the conventional view is that Brexit has been an economic disaster, that it's hit the size of the economy measured by GDP very hard, and it's had a big knock-on effect on other things, including trade, investment, and inflation. My approach to this is to say that if there is going to be a big effect, then surely we can see that quite easily in the data. So I'm quite a big fan of drawing quite simple charts that compare the performance of the UK economy with those of similar economies in Europe or in the rest of the world. And the first of my slides does this. So what it does is it compares the level of GDP over time in the UK with the Eurozone economies, excluding Ireland. And the reason I've excluded Ireland is that their data are completely distorted by the activities of multinationals. So any European aggregate that includes Ireland is straight away to be ignored. And what my chart basically shows is that the growth rate of the UK economy since 2016, so since we voted to leave the European Union, has been pretty similar to that average of countries in the Eurozone using the single currency. Indeed, the obvious big movement in this period was the collapse during the COVID pandemic, and that has had a far bigger impact than anything that might be attributed to Brexit. So that's the overall level. Then move to my slide 5. So the next slide, though, digs into some individual countries, and it's often pointed out that our economy has grown much more slowly than countries like Italy and Greece over the last 10 years or so. And what this chart does is it looks at the level of national income per head. So it adjusts for the size of the population. And it's also a measure that allows me to compare like with like. So it's translating euros and pounds into a common currency. In this case, happens to be the US dollar. And it adjusts for inflation and differences in the value of a pound or a dollar in different parts of Europe. And what you can see here is that more recently, there have been relatively good growth in both Greece and Italy. But that's because they're starting from much lower starting points. So both countries, particularly Greece, were hit very hard by the global financial crisis and the fallout from the euro area debt crisis. So Greece's GDP per head, if you like, its standard of living, is actually still lower now than it was about 20 or 30 years ago. So no wonder it's growing more quickly, because it is catching up. But the fact that it's outpaced the UK over this period is really nothing to do with Brexit.
So one of the key takeaways, therefore, is that many Eurozone countries are poor countries, and it's the fact that they're rising so rapidly because they're poor countries that is skewing the overall result for the EU on this metric.
That's exactly right. So what you need to do is to find countries to compare the UK to who are similar, in particular in terms of their standard of living to begin with. So that's the sort of country we should be looking at. So my next chart compares the UK to, I think, the two best examples to look at in the rest of Europe. One is Germany, where growth has recently been very weak. That is partly to do with the fallout from the energy crisis, which has hit Germany particularly hard. But of course, the UK has had an energy crisis as well. And actually, our industrial electricity prices are the highest in Europe, even higher than in Germany. So the fact that Germany has performed poorly because of the energy crisis might be telling us something about the UK as well. And again, nothing to do with Brexit.
If I could just interrupt you there, does that mean, because France, of course, has so many nuclear power stations, isn't suffering from an energy crisis in the same way as Germany and Britain are, I understand? If it wasn't for the energy crisis, would Britain be outperforming France, given how close we are on these charts?
Exactly. Outperforming or continuing to do very similarly. But if Brexit was having a big negative impact, then we would have fallen well behind France. And the key point is that hasn't happened.
Yes, and if our viewers can see the chart of the red and green lines, I mean, they're basically matching each other for the entire duration from 2005 to 2025, with no noticeable change in that following 2016 or when we later got the Brexit deal at all.
I think that's right. So what's remarkable, I think, is how unremarkable UK growth is relative to other countries, other big countries in Europe. So there's, not a huge amount to see there, as Julian said. If Brexit was having a big catastrophic impact, we would be seeing a very big divergence.
Excellent. Well, so what are some of the other more recent claims we have? Julian and David can both discuss this. For example, we hear that Brexit has wiped off 4% of our GDP, even 8% of our GDP we've had. We're told that it's reducing by 4% a year. We even had, I think, on the cover of The Observer, something along those lines as well. What is the truth and what's going on, really?
Well, I'm not one of those people that says that Brexit has had no negative impact. I think inevitably, if you have such a big surprise as the decision to leave the European Union, it's bound to have some knock-on effects on uncertainty and therefore on business investment. And there has also been, a definite increase in the frictions to trade between the UK and the European Union. So it would be odd to say that there's been no effect at all. But I would say that the effect has been much smaller than anticipated. I'd also suggest that a lot of that effect will be only temporary. So particularly the falls in business investment linked to the increase in uncertainty. So the new system is now bedding down, and businesses are willing to invest, and it's, they understand what the new barriers to trade are going to be. So there's been an initial impact, but I think a fairly small one. And over time, hopefully the benefits of Brexit will build. And there will be a point, hopefully sooner rather than later, when the balance switches from a net negative to a net positive. But if we look at some of the estimates that other people have come up with for the magnitude of the negative impact, I think, frankly, they fail a basic smell test. The numbers are too big, both compared to what you might expect the impact of the decision to leave the European Union to have on the economy, but also in terms of what's actually happened. It would result, if you plug in the numbers that people suggest for the size of the hit into what's actually happened, you end up with an outcome that is way different from reality, and would have us, for example, performing pretty much as strongly as the United States, despite the exceptional tailwinds that the US has had and we haven't.
So if we look at this graph, which shows the counterfactual, which some people have estimated if the UK had stayed in the EU, and this comes from an economics report from the NBER, which is done by some very good economists, and technically it's it's some good work. But as Julian says, the first thing to look at is how does that fit in with the sort of real world data. And if we look here, you can see that if we had this 8% hit to the UK economy, which is what these economists sort of concluded, they had actually a range of figures, but that was their sort of central figure, which has had a lot of attention in the media, then the UK would have vastly outperformed GDP in France, in Italy, even in Spain, and would have been quite close to where the US has performed. And we know the US is very, very different. It's had much lower energy costs than all the countries in Europe. To argue that the only reason the UK has been behind the US is because of Brexit, which is essentially what this outcome is concluding, doesn't really make sense. And what this sort of approach has done is to try and compare UK growth to growth of a sort of bundle of all other countries. But that bundle of all other developed countries, that bundle includes very fast growing countries in Eastern Europe like Poland, Bulgaria, some of the Northern European countries like Estonia and Latvia, who are coming from much lower income level, and we would expect to be increasing their GDP faster, but also the USA. So we have got to be very, very careful in how we interpret those. And I think it's not really credible to conclude that there was an 8% reduction in GDP from leaving the EU when you look at the raw data. We can't rule out that there was some impact. As Julian was saying, there's been changes to uncertainty in business investment, particularly in the run-up to Brexit itself. After the referendum, there were all sorts of debates about how we would deal with it. So understandably, there was uncertainty. But everything has a trade-off. So there may be costs from leaving the European Union. There's also benefits. We'll come on to some of those later, but in particular, you can hope that trade will become easier with non-EU countries, and that will give some boost to the UK economy. So I think it's fair to say there may have been a short-run hit to GDP, not at the level that some of these papers have been discussing, like 8%, but it's very hard to pinpoint because so many other things are going on at the same time, such as COVID, which had a drastic effect on GDP, but also crucially, the vast increase in energy costs, which the UK has been particularly affected almost as much as Germany, and much more so than countries like the US. So it's very hard to pinpoint the causal effect of Brexit. I think we can when we look at the raw data, conclude if there was an effect, it was not very large.
Yeah, well, if we were to do another counterfactual of my own, imagine that we didn't have COVID and Brexit, and imagine we got the Brexit that David Frost, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Dan Hannan wanted. Would our trajectory be closer to this, or what's your personal opinion on this, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, that's speculation. I think it is fair to say that once you've left the European Union, that the reason for doing that is to take advantage of changes to regulation and trade that we think we can do better than, or are more suitable for the UK than the European Union. I think it's also fair to say that politicians haven't been that keen to grasp many of those opportunities. Some of them have in terms of different trading relationships. So I think my view is that, yes, had we been more enthusiastic in saying, well, whether or not we thought leaving was a good idea, we'll now try and make the best of it, then our GDP performance would have been better. But I think actually the big factors such as COVID and the energy crisis actually outweigh any impact from leaving the European Union, even if we had taken more advantage of the freedoms we have.
And there's another point to make here, which is, of course, that for most of our viewers, in fact, most of the country, Brexit really wasn't about the economy. They were voting for very different reasons. They were voting because of immigration. They were voting because of what they saw as social and cultural change. We know that from the polling. For a minority of people like myself, it was primarily about sovereignty and independence. There were different reasons, and a lot of polling showed that Brexit voters did expect there to be a slight hit to GDP. They did expect there to be some minor negative consequences, but they were they thought that was a trade-off that was worth having, worthwhile being just slightly poorer for the other benefits. Unfortunately, instead of that, we had more immigration after Brexit than we had before, with 7% of the population changing in 3 years, thanks to the Boris waves. But one last point on this chart, people may be wondering why Italy has become a great powerhouse suddenly out of nowhere, because of course, I think that was the last time it was above the UK in the G7 was in the late 80s or early 90s, very briefly, and it certainly hasn't been an economic powerhouse relative to France, Germany or Britain since then. So can you, for our viewers, explain why they're doing so well?
Well, this is not about their level. This is about the growth in GDP, and this is per capita, and they have been doing better relative to the UK per capita. As Julian said, that's partly because of the big hit Italy had after the financial crash and the Eurozone crisis. So they're recovering over the past few years up to a level they perhaps would have been without that crash. So that probably explains their relative difference compared, for example, to Germany, which wasn't hit so badly by the Eurozone crash, but has been really hit by the energy crisis like the UK.
Good. Now, of course, we've also had many, many other headlines being pumped out over Brexit, such as that Brexit has cost us £100 billion. For either of you or both of you, where do these stories come from and what are they basing these claims on?
Well, there are basically three different approaches that people use to try and quantify the economic impact of Brexit. So one approach is to try and find a group of countries that have performed similarly to the UK in the past, and then compare their performance now with that of the UK, and to conclude that any difference in the performance of the UK and that group of countries must have been due to Brexit. And there are lots of ifs and buts in there. So, of course, lots of things have happened since 2016 that might have affected the performance of the UK economy more than other countries, including COVID and the energy crisis. So I'm very skeptical of that approach. It's sometimes called the doppelganger method, and it's based on a mathematical technique called synthetic control models, which are perfectly legitimate, but I don't think are very helpful in these circumstances. The second thing people did was they did a lot of modelling around the time of the Brexit referendum back in 2015, 2016, to try and guess what they thought the impact of Brexit would be. Now, that, of course, is very difficult to do because they didn't know what form the Brexit deal would take. And a lot of them assumed that the Brexit deal would be, not a great deal, that would end up with huge increases in trade barriers with the European Union. And they came out with some quite scary numbers. But the reality was the trade deal we ended up with the European Union was actually a pretty good one. It's essentially tariff-free and quota-free, as long as goods meet certain technical criteria. So I think those models I tend to put them to one side. And then the third thing some people have tried to do is model what's actually happened and try and strip out the effect of a Brexit on particular parts of the economy. And I think that is probably the most sensible approach because it reflects the reality. But it's still extremely difficult to do. And I'm surprised sometimes that economists think they come up with a definite answer to this. Usually we economists can, argue about everything. The joke is if you ask, two economists, you'll get three different opinions on any particular subject. So the idea that we can precisely strip out the impact of Brexit from everything else that is going on. But I do think even some of the more reputable studies that have done this actually have come up with some pretty small numbers in the bigger scheme of things, a few percentage points either way on growth in trade or the increases in prices at a time where there've been much, much bigger underlying swings in trade and prices that you can really explain. So as a consequence of that, I'm skeptical of any modelling that comes up with a really big number because it just doesn't seem to fit the facts, the reality on the ground, which is our economy has continued to perform pretty similarly to those of our peers. And where there are big differences, they can be explained by non-Brexit factors like relatively high energy costs.
And you'd agree with that?
Yeah, completely. Yes. I think, as I said earlier, it's been fairly unremarkable GDP growth for the UK relative to other similar countries. And so the idea that there's been some catastrophic impact of Brexit isn't really credible.
Well, you've discussed making models before the Brexit deal was struck. That's led to some claims to continue to have relevance today. You've mentioned trade as well, so let's combine those two. There was pre-trade deal modelling created showing that there would be a 14 or indeed 15% decline in goods and services trade, which is something called trade intensity by economists, and that fall in trade would lead to a significant productivity fall of about 4% of GDP over 14 years. And as I've mentioned earlier, that's also been repeated a lot, including on the front page of The Observer. So can we actually look at that then? So what is the situation with regards to Britain and the EU when it comes to trade in goods and services?
So that 15% figure came from the Office of Budget Responsibility, the OBR, and that was one of their assumptions when they were modelling what the impact of Brexit would be. And they suggested there would be a 15% hit, not to trade with the EU, but to total UK trade with the whole world. That's quite a remarkable figure because only roughly half our trade was with the EU. That was suggesting there would be a very catastrophic impact on UK-EU trade. So yeah, it's important to look at what's actually happened. If we look at this chart on UK goods trade, so if you look at this chart, you can see there's quite a lot of volatility to UK trade. The blue line is UK exports to the EU. The orange line is to non-EU countries. And you can see that since 2019 or so, there has been a big drop to goods exports to the EU. We've got to be quite careful because some of that period includes the COVID time when, of course, exports really drastically shot down. So this sort of would underpin the argument, oh, yes, there's been a big drop to goods trade with the EU. But there's lots of caveats here. In the first place, when we left the EU around about 2019, 2020, we had changes to rules of origin which meant the classification of some exports were changed. So something that would previously have come into the UK, partly produced from, say, China, and then re-exported to, let's say, Ireland, would previously have counted as an export to the EU, but no longer does. So part of that reduction is sort of artificial due to measurement changes, and it's not clear exactly what that change is. So we have to be quite careful. The other thing to say is, well, goods exports from the UK have dropped both to the EU and to other countries. And part of that reason is back down to what we've been talking about earlier, to the high energy costs, which has caused a big change in manufacturing, driven parts of the chemical industry out of the UK, has also led to reductions in exports of oil and gas, which are really policy derived because we've taken a choice to not increase production from North Sea oil, for example. So some of this reduction in goods trade to the EU is actually not to do with Brexit at all. Okay. But if we go on to say, well, what's happened to trade overall? Because remember, goods are only part of our trade. We also trade in services. And for the UK, services have traditionally been much more important than goods for our export, which doesn't fit in so well with the EU model. Their sort of free market, single market is much more oriented to goods trade. So if we look at this next chart, so this chart tells us what happened to total trade, that's imports and exports, all the two things separately over this time. We can see again the hit from COVID, that sort of dip in all these graphs. But actually total trade, exports and imports have all increased. And this data is in real terms, so it takes account of price changes. And it depends where you want to measure it. If we go back from the year before the referendum, exports have increased by about 23% in total to both the EU and non-EU. So the idea that the UK might have seen a 15% drop in trade hasn't been borne out. Of course, other things may be going on, so we can't completely rule out that there was some net effect of Brexit. But in fact, if we say, well, let's compare this to GDP growth, the UK trade has actually been growing faster than the rest of the economy. So it's outperformed GDP growth. And that's true wherever we measure it from. If we measure it from before the referendum, from 2019, just before, we formally left the EU, or the year later, which is a bit difficult because we've got COVID going on, but that was a year we left the single market. There was a year's grace between leaving the EU and leaving the single market and customs union. And wherever we measure it, trade has increased in real terms by more than GDP. So the idea that Brexit has caused a 15% reduction in total trade doesn't seem to be credible. What's interesting is the OBR was still making this claim even as late as autumn 2025, in that every year they do a sort of projection and a survey of where they think the economy is. Even just 4 or 5 months ago, they were still using this assumption as their best guess that Brexit would lead to a 15% drop in trade. It's hard to know how they could still include that in their assessment, given what we knew even then. Now we've got the 2025 trade data, and we can see that, trade has continued to increase. Well, one question, though, that's quite interesting is, yes, there's been a rebalancing. So we've had trade deals with the non-EU countries, which has seen an increase in trade with non-EU countries. If you look at trade just with the EU, but include goods and services, and if we look at this next chart, so this shows us total UK exports to the European Union, and going up to 2025. The last month of 2025 is estimated because the Office of National Statistics haven't produced that data, broken that data down yet, but it will be close to what we've got here. Actually, we can see that even trade to the European Union has increased, is higher in real terms than before the referendum, and indeed since we left the European Union back in 2020. It's not gone up as much. It's about 3.9%, just under 4% higher than in 2019. So it's not gone up as much as trade to the rest of the world, but it has actually increased. So when we take into account services, which for the UK are very, very important, we actually haven't even seen a reduction in total trade to the European Union at all. So my sort of take from that is it's likely that there was some hit from Brexit to goods trade, in that even though we had a very good trade deal, tariff-free, quota-free, there was some increase in non-tariff barriers, so border costs, which perhaps have particularly affected smaller firms. It's quite hard to quantify that because of the changes to measurement and so on, but I think it's reasonable that there was some hit. But when you look overall, trade to the European Union has not collapsed. Not only is it not collapsed, it's actually increased in real terms. But we have seen a shift towards more trade in services and a relative shift to better trade with the rest of the world, which reflects some of the trade deals we've had with Australia, with New Zealand, with the Pacific region, and many other countries, which is what we would have expected. One of the advantages of Brexit was allowing us to have easier trade with non-EU countries.
And I think one of the key headlines to take away from there in terms of goods, from what you said, of course, is that they've also changed the way in which trade exports are measured for goods. So, of course, that also skews things and makes it impossible to actually to give a definitive answer.
So it does make it hard, particularly there's a lot of talk on the food and agricultural sector. There was some goods. So, for example, we had quite a big export trade in orange juice. Actually, does the UK produce orange juice? No, it may process orange juice, but we don't grow many oranges in the UK. And that's a classic case where goods that were, largely produced elsewhere, but there was some processing in the UK and then re-exported would no longer be counted as exports. But it's quite hard to quantify how big an effect that we have there. That we don't have good data, I don't think, on.
But it's a really important, I think it's much more than an accounting error. I would say that's a very big, potentially in some areas. Yeah. Now, do you think, though, given how positive the end result is here, will the OBR now be obliged to make more positive forecasts? And how can they avoid being more positive given what you've just presented?
I don't think they can sustain any longer that Brexit has caused a 15% reduction in total trade. I mean, actually, that was meant to be over a period of time. So they could say, well, there's a couple of years left in that period they were basing that on. And I want to be clear, with this sort of data, we can't completely rule out any impact of Brexit on trade. I think if you look at the raw data that shows total UK trade increasing faster than GDP, it's more likely than not that the net impact of Brexit has been to increase trade, but we can't completely rule out that there was some small negative effect overall because there's so many other things going on. But I think, yes, that does mean that the OBR can no longer sustain an assumption of a huge drop in UK trade as underpinning other changes in the economy. So it'll be interesting to see how they change their next sort of survey of the UK economy, if they just sort of quietly drop that figure or they address it head on.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think they have quietly dropped it. If you look at the most recent two 6-monthly forecasts that they've produced, the 4% overall hit to productivity and the 15% fall in trade intensity barely appear at all. You actually have to search the document. They might pop up in a footnote. And I think it's worth stressing that there were only ever working assumptions made up 10, 15 years ago. They're not original work by the OBR. They're not numbers that are actually particularly important for the OBR forecasts, which are for the public finances over the next 5 years. That's the thing they're really interested in. So the OBR hasn't actually put an enormous amount of work into these assumptions. I suspect that they regret making them because they have got, been given far more importance than even I think the OBR would say that they deserve. But it is, I think, worth continuing to push them on this and to say that, these figures have crept out into the public domain as the official view, even the government's view, when in fact they're based on very flimsy foundations.
Well, Julian, also, of course, now, as we've already indicated, the period from 2016 to 2020 was a period of profound uncertainty for the British economy. We're getting used to what was the lay of the land going to be post-Brexit. We also, of course, had, as a result of that, very low investment historically in the British economy, in British industry, etc. Part of that, I suppose, was also because the EU, part of that uncertainty was because the EU was being very, very hard in its negotiations. It wanted to ensure that we had a painful Brexit so that others wouldn't follow suit, supported by some masochists inside the UK as well, it has to be said. But how does investment stand now in this country post-Brexit?
Well, to answer that question, this slide, which is actually produced by the Office for National Statistics, shows what's been happening to the level of business investment since the Brexit referendum. And I think it is no coincidence that business investment basically froze in the few years after the vote to leave. So from 2016 onwards, there are several years where business investment was basically flat, whereas normally you'd be expecting that to grow. I think a significant part of that would be due to the impact of the Brexit referendum on business uncertainty. So businesses simply didn't know what the future shape of the trading relationship with the EU would be. And this was at a period when they were being warned that the economy was about to dive into a deep recession simply as a result of the vote to leave. So it's understandable that lots of people decided not to invest when they might otherwise have done. There were other factors going on at the same time. This is a good example of how Brexit wasn't the only thing that was happening. So around about 2016, 2017 was also the peak in car production across Europe, not just in the UK, but also in countries like Germany. partly because of the beginning of the transition to electric vehicles and so on, and the rapid growth of competition from Chinese car manufacturers. And obviously the car sector is still quite an important part of business investment in the UK. So there are non-Brexit related factors going on as well. And then we had the additional shocks of COVID in particular. But rolling forward to now, what we're seeing is actually business investment has done pretty well over the last few years. It seems to be back on track to where it might have been if we hadn't had the Brexit vote. And a lot of that, I think, is simply due to the easing of Brexit uncertainty. There are various ways that you can measure the importance of Brexit in business decisions. For the period after the vote to leave and around the time of the actual exit, Brexit was right up there amongst the top of concerns for most businesses. If it wasn't first, it was typically second or third. Now it's just dropped way down the list of things that businesses are worried about. So in a sense, it seems odd that the government is prioritizing, fixing some of the problems that Brexit is supposed to create, when in fact most businesses are not really that bothered about it. They're far more concerned about things like geopolitical risks or high energy prices or increased labour market regulation. Brexit is nowhere near as important a factor for almost all businesses that it was initially. So the easing of Brexit uncertainty has allowed business investment to recover. And interestingly, the OBR itself, when it was talking about the initial negative impact of Brexit, it did stress the impact through the investment channel, and then caveat that by saying that over time it expected that effect to unwind. So in a sense, this is something the OBR has got right. So the Office of Budget Responsibility was saying that some of that initial hit would be temporary, and actually that's proved to be correct.
And yes, and if we put the chart back up, I mean, it's quite clear here. At the very end of the chart, you've got UK leaves the EU single market and customs union. And it's that certainty, that leads to that huge rise in investment. Obviously, Brexit wasn't the issue. It was uncertainty that was the issue, clearly. The other key takeaway, of course, is to imagine where we would be had we not had the financial crisis, because if we continued the trajectory we were on in 2007, it'd be very interesting to see how we would have.
That's true. And just one thing to add. It is interesting and we'll come on to it later, I think, about what the current government are trying to do in terms of moving back towards the EU. There is a risk that will add to uncertainty because businesses won't know what the outcome is going to be. So there is a danger there that we may, risk this improvement to business investment.
That's very true. There were two great tragedies for Brexit. One for me was the manner in which the negotiations started and were carried on, and the way that the EU handled them. You can agree or disagree on whether the Brexit deal was the best deal we could have got as well. But undoubtedly, the second tragedy for Brexit was, of course, the double whammy of COVID and the Ukraine war falling almost immediately afterwards, as they did, and they both, of course, impacted the British economy hugely. How would either of you like to characterize the impact of COVID and the Ukraine war on public perceptions of how Brexit has been, on whether it's been a success to the economy, and particularly on the impact on inflation?
I mean, there's lots to say there. One thing I think is it clearly muddies the waters for economists like us who want to analyse the impact of Brexit. And what's interesting for me is those factors, Ukraine war and COVID, had huge hits to the UK economy, which Brexit doesn't seem to have. So it was always my view, although I was broadly in favour of Brexit, my view was, there were pros and cons and there were arguments on both sides. And probably the economic argument was overstated in terms of the hits. And I think that's sort of been borne out. These other geopolitical factors tend to be much more important. And to add to the Ukraine war and the COVID crisis, I'd put the energy crisis and net zero policies as well as having a much bigger impact on the economy than Brexit itself. But of course, from the public perception, I think it becomes easier to fit things into your preconceived views. If you're a politician who wants to say that Brexit is a disaster, you can look to any sort of period where there's been a hit for all sorts of other reasons and say, oh, well, yes, look at the impact of Brexit. So that's why you've got to be quite careful and say, how have things changed relative to other countries? How have we done relative to Germany or to France on trade and on GDP growth? And of course, there the picture is much more nuanced.
Just to add to that, I think maybe there was a tendency before Brexit for supporters of Brexit to blame everything that was going wrong on the fact that we are a member of the European Union. But now the pendulum has swung the other way round. So people are blaming everything that's going wrong on the decision to leave the European Union. And it's a very convenient excuse for lots of businesses, of course, to say that we're doing badly because of Brexit, or, people are not coming to our museum or art gallery because of Brexit, even though the art gallery down the road is doing perfectly fine. So it's become a very convenient excuse for all of the problems that the UK economy is facing. And I think that's one reason why the opinion polls seem to have swung so far against Brexit, because everybody's using it as an excuse for things that are going wrong.
And I think, and mentioning energy costs, very true. Obviously, we have the highest energy costs in Europe still, I believe. Perhaps we'll go higher now because of Iran. But, William Clouston at the SDP came out with some remarkable statistics on research they had done that showed if you took away the excess energy costs for the past 20 years, it amounts to over £300 billion.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we sort of put it more broadly into climate change policies, net zero policies, that's partly caused the increase in energy costs, but you also have the direct expenditure and subsidies of government expenditure, which have affected the public finances and, made it much harder for the government to do other things they might want to do in terms of infrastructure and so on that might have helped UK growth. It's probably had an impact certainly on investment, which in turn has an impact on innovation. So there's all sorts of channels whereby energy is having an impact on the UK economy. And that, that's perhaps what we should be talking about more rather than Brexit. But Brexit continues to be that sort of lightning rod, I think, which still divides many people. And I think we're also perhaps affected by, there are some economists and observers who perhaps never got out of the mindset of thinking, well, this was a terrible thing that we did. Now, I think you can actually be on either side of whether you think Brexit was a good idea in the first place. Once we've decided to leave the European Union, though, I think there should be, or I would hope there'd be more agreement on whether we can do things that will take advantage of the fact that we're out, rather than reliving debates and thinking, okay, we'll sort of try and be half in and half out, which may lead to sort of unintended consequences, and you do it, for one particular economic benefit, but then you cause a cost elsewhere in terms of queering the pitch with our developing relationships with non-EU countries, for example.
But let's compare ourselves again to Europe, and let's, turn our gaze back over across the channel. Obviously, the EU is also hampered by net zero very, very much. But in addition to that, we had the Draghi report on EU competitiveness, which had announced some severe challenges for the European economy. Over-regulation, high energy costs, obviously, as well, but slowing productivity too was cited, and of course, increased competition now from outside of Europe as well. How would either of you characterize the state of the EU economy and how it's, how the EU is now for a model of economic prosperity?
Well, I think it's a failing model. And what's interesting is how many natural supporters of the idea of a united Europe or the European Union in one form or another are now recognizing that. So I think the Draghi report was very interesting in that respect. And it actually explicitly identified lots of ways in which the European Union is holding back growth. So the massive amounts of regulation of economic activity within the European Union area are effectively an enormous internal trade barrier, which we would replicate if we, either rejoined the European Union or, worse still, became a rule taker, taking the EU rules without having any influence on what they are. So I think that would be an extremely dangerous direction in which to move. It's often said that the European Union is the world's biggest free trade bloc. It is in a sense, but equally it's the world's biggest protectionist bloc, because, the European Union is so bad at doing free trade deals with countries in the rest of the world. It takes the European Union probably 10, 20 years to do a trade deal that an independent sovereign nation like the UK could probably do in 1 or 2 years. And that's what we've seen. And since Brexit, the UK has moved much more quickly on lowering trade barriers to the rest of the world than would have been the case if we were still a member of the European Union. So the European Union, I think, is a failing model. It regulates too much, and it's too slow to negotiate new and better trade deals with other countries. So that's two ways in which Brexit can be a positive for the UK economy. Lowering trade barriers with the rest of the world, while at the same time improving the way that we regulate the economy at home.
Just to pick up on one aspect of the regulation, there's an increasing body of economics research looking specifically at the EU's GDPR regulations in terms of data protection. And it's very interesting when you compare the EU to the US, that a number of economists have identified a causal impact of GDPR in restricting innovation. So relative to countries without GDPR and controlling for other factors, innovation seems to be hit in the EU. There was a paper just came out last month looking specifically at medical trials, and so arguing that there'd been roughly an 18% reduction in medical trials in the EU directly because of GDPR, that one particular regulation. And not only were there a reduction in trials, there was a movement of trials to outside the European Union, and the trials that did happen were less likely to be successful or come to an end point. So that's just one aspect of regulation, and we can, argue about whether regulations are good or not good, but I think there's an acceptance that the EU has not been going down a route which has been positive for growth. So energy is one side of things, but when you compare to the US in particular, productivity growth in the US, clearly there is an innovation story to be told there where the EU has been dragged back. So one of the interesting things for the UK will be, well, can we take advantage of the freedom we have from being outside the EU in some of these areas and go down a different path, not necessarily to deregulate and have a free-for-all, but to regulate in a slightly cannier way that's of more benefit to innovation for the UK. And that's, perhaps we've done a little bit of, but perhaps not enough. And the danger is if we move back towards the EU model, or even agreeing to be part of their rules, that will limit our ability to take advantage of, the problems of not having the problems in the EU.
Well, let's dig a little deeper into that, actually, because, when we hear about Brexit, we're always hearing about trade barriers with Europe. But are there actually areas where leaving the EU has made trade easier? And what do you think are the areas or the ways in which Brexit has actually helped the British economy?
Yeah, so there's certainly lots of ways. We might wish we'd done more. But the simplest way is that being out of the European Union and out of the customs union, we have the ability to decide what tariffs will be, what we will charge on goods coming into the country. And there may be an argument that, we want to be careful about UK producers and farmers, but there are some goods we don't produce at all, like bananas, for example, or some other tropical fruits. And in those cases, there's really not a good argument for having high import tariffs. All they do is increase prices for consumers. So one of the things we have done is to reduce import tariffs on a range of goods where we have a very small or no market at all. And that's an unabridged benefit from Brexit for our consumers. Beyond that, we've also had a number of trade deals, some of which were replicating things which the EU had with non-EU countries. But in many cases, we went further and we've had more detailed trade deals that benefit us and our emphasis on services. So trade deals with Australia, with Japan, burgeoning one with India, potentially one with the USA. And as Julian, I think, said earlier, we've proved to be a bit more fleet-footed in getting these deals across the line, whereas the EU is still struggling with the deal for Australia. I don't know how long that's been going on. I think it's over 10 years they've been trying to get a deal.
Usually decades.
We managed to get a deal. We could argue whether it's exactly the right deal, but we got a deal which is of some benefit to the UK in a much shorter period of time. So yes, there have been some very clear benefits in terms of trade.
And equally on regulation as well, there have been a number of areas where the UK has moved in what I think is definitely the right direction. So financial services, life sciences, animal welfare standards. We've actually improved them in a number of areas compared to the European Union. To the extent that, I take the city as an example here. I think if you'd ask most people in the city, back in 2016, they would be, strongly against Brexit. And there were lots of scare stories about hundreds of thousands of jobs potentially being lost to other financial centres. That simply hasn't happened. Instead, the mood in the city has swung towards being much more positive about Brexit. So the new mayor of the City of London has said, it's very important to not to move back towards copying EU regulations. We're doing much better outside. And that mood actually is being replicated amongst some European banks and insurance companies who've been looking at the more dynamic model of financial services in the UK and saying, why can't the EU start to copy that? So it's not just the City of London that is viewing Brexit now as a positive for UK financial services, but some important players in the European Union itself are saying, why can't we be more like the UK? So that's financial services. But I think the general principle applies to pretty much any sector. The rules that we would come up with on our own from scratch would tend to be better than the rules that would be designed for the very diverse group of countries within the European Union, where what's right for them isn't necessarily right for us. And by the way, it's probably not even right for them either.
Okay. Just on the financial services, so one area which is small but quite important perhaps for people watching this, if you look at contactless payments, so we now have £100 limits on contactless payments. That's one of the areas where we were able to change our regulations because of Brexit. So you look at the European Union, the limit is still, with some exceptions for some types of trade, around about €40. So very different. So we've had an area where we've looked at the risks and the benefits and said, well, actually £100 seems a better level to balance security concerns with ease of payments. So every time you buy something in the supermarket that costs more than about £30 to £40 and you use contactless and save yourself that period of time, you can say, well, that's one of the Brexit benefits we've seen already.
Right, very good. We'll have to add up how long it takes and multiply that by how many transactions a year you do. Well, looking back at the UK then, the Remain narrative regarding the economy has remained the dominant one. What impact do you think that's had on our economy and on our nation? And tied into that, what do you think that's been given Labour carte blanche to do, using the Remain narrative? What advantages has it given Labour? Things like, for example, a customs union, possibly. Either of you?
Well, as I say, I think that there has been a shift. Initially, when Labour was elected in 2024, I think they're trying to steer quite a sensible middle ground, which is to identify particular aspects of the new trade agreement that we had with the European Union and improve things a little bit at the margin. So these are small things like mutual recognition of professional qualifications or a sort of a common veterinary agreement in areas which are pretty uncontroversial. While at the same time, the government was pressing ahead with new free trade deals with other countries in the rest of the world. And I think that was a reasonable position to take. But we now seem to be at a crossroads where either we're going to move towards much, much closer relations with the European Union, or we're going to step back and recognize that we're not going to get a much better deal with the European Union. Instead, we should be prioritizing making the most of the benefits of Brexit. And unfortunately, this is where internal party politics within Labour seem to be the key driver now. So the Prime Minister is relatively weak. A lot of his potential rivals to be the next leader are taking a much more openly pro-EU position, and even going as far as they can to suggest that we should rejoin some form of customs union with the EU as the first step towards rejoining completely. So we've moved away from that slightly awkward middle of the road position towards moving closer to the European Union, almost just for the sake of it. And of course, this puts us in a very weak position because the European Union knows that we are the weaker partner in negotiations because we want to do a deal. And as you suggested earlier, they still want to punish us for daring to vote to leave. So I think we are unfortunately heading back in the direction of unwinding a lot of the benefits of Brexit, but without really dealing with any of the underlying problems that might be caused. So to choose one classic example, we may well end up as rule takers with the European Union, which is the worst possible position to be in. Just automatically have to incorporate their rules with no say whatsoever in how those rules are made.
Yeah, so it's worth dealing with the customs union because there's been lots of talk about whether we should rejoin that, and that's going to help the trading situation. As we've seen, there's perhaps not a problem that we need to solve in terms of UK trade, but we need to be clear, the customs union on its own, without joining the single market or effectively rejoining the European Union, seems to solve no problems at all because we already have tariff-free, quota-free trade with the EU. Joining the customs union wouldn't mean we're in the single market, so it wouldn't put a stop to border the costs of trade, which we've had. Or what it would do is put a stop to us having independent trade agreements with other countries. So we would have to scrap a whole series of agreements which make having freer trade with Japan, with Australia, with New Zealand, with the US, with India, Canada, with a whole series of other countries. So politically, some politicians have sort of leapt on the customs union. I think when you look at the detail, it's hard to see how that can survive. If you're outside the European Union, there seems to be no benefit at all from joining the customs union. What we do have, though, is much firmer proposals in the so-called UK-EU reset for the UK to rejoin some aspects of the single market, particularly in food and agriculture. So the Labour government have proposed that they are in the middle of negotiations to align our regulations on food, animals, agriculture with the European Union. And that's a very interesting case because they're saying, well, this will make it easier for UK farmers to export to the European Union. We need to be clear. Imports of food from the European Union are roughly 4 times UK exports. We import, depending on how you measure it, about £40 billion worth of food and animal products from the European Union each year and export about 10 or 11 billion pounds. So any improvement in the sort of costs of trade, because the argument is that if we align our food regulations, we can then reduce the border costs when you're exporting or importing food. The main advantage of that, of course, will be to EU producers who dominate the exports to the UK market. But as Julian said, the other issue is that what the government are proposing is not that we will agree a common set of regulations, but the UK will agree to follow whatever the European Union rules are. So if the European Union decides to change a rule on animal welfare, or on some level of food standards. And let's be clear, the European Union doesn't have a great track record of food safety. But if they change a regulation there, the UK automatically has to follow it. What that means is that at the moment, if you're exporting to the European Union, of course, you have to export to their standards, just as any country exporting to the UK does, and that's perfectly reasonable. But the vast majority of companies do not export to the European Union, and that's particularly the case in terms of food and agriculture. All those companies would then be affected by a change in regulation over which we have no say. And the regulations, of course, will be designed for the benefit of European Union countries who may have very different economies, very different agricultural sectors, and they may quite understandably set their rules to benefit their sectors. But that would affect the whole of the UK food and agricultural economy. So it's a really dangerous path to go down. The other aspect of it is, of course, it would also affect non-EU countries importing food to the UK. And that's one of the advantages of Brexit, that we've been able to sort of expand the places where we can obtain our food from. It's been a bit easier to get food from, which we need, from non-EU countries. And in general, having a broader source of supply is a good thing from a security point of view, but also from the point of view of competition. The danger of the EU-UK reset is that other countries exporting to the UK will also have to then follow the European Union rules, which will make it harder for them to export. So there's a case for saying, well, the European Union, they have a really good motivation because they will make it harder for the UK to import non-EU food, easier to import EU food. The other kicker to this argument is that part of the agreement will be for the privilege of the UK following EU rules. We are going to be paying the European Union a sum of money. That sum of money has not been revealed, but I suspect it will not be a trivial sum of money. So one of the benefits of Brexit we haven't mentioned is the fact we no longer pay 20 billion or so pounds to the European Union each year. We will henceforward be paying a significant sum of money for the privilege of agreeing to follow their rules without having any say on how those rules are set.
And paying to harm our farmers here in this country as well, because they'll obviously be affected.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, the argument will be that for farmers who export food to the European Union, there may be some small benefit in terms of reduced costs in terms of border controls.
But they're a minority.
They're a minority. So we need, like all these things, there is a trade-off. It's never, all benefits or all costs. And I think the costs here are very significant, and it's important we at least consider what they might be.
I should say that this sort of discussion is really important in the context of opinion polling, because the latest opinion polls say that a majority of people would now vote to rejoin the European Union. And that's how the debate is framed. But if you specify the choices more accurately, then I think the numbers will be very different. So, for example, if you ask most people, who do you think should decide tariff policy in the UK, overwhelming majority would say the British government should do that. But that is incompatible with rejoining a customs union, for example, let alone rejoining the EU, full stop. So the important thing is to frame the question properly. It can't just be a vague in or out of the EU. I think you need to explain to people what the choices are, what the trade-offs are of making that. And I think if you were to do that properly, you still have a decent majority in favour of Brexit.
There is some, sorry, Rafe, there is some evidence of that. So there is a series of polls which ask, would you rejoin the EU? And then the second question, if it meant joining the euro, would you want to rejoin the EU? And you get a very different answer. You tend to get a majority saying no. And of course, joining the euro is a condition of any new member of the EU. So whether the UK would get an exemption if we rejoined, on the face of it, that would be against EU law. Who knows what would happen in practice? But it's absolutely right. If you ask the question accurately, what would rejoining the EU mean? There's even current opinion is not so clearly in favour of rejoining the EU.
Well, that's why I think this conversation is so important, because as you say, the numbers of people who are in favour of Brexit now are greatly diminished from how they were. A large part of that is because the unrelenting propagandizing that we've had from one side, who have complete control, it seems, over our legacy media, and the number of outlets where you actually do get contrary viewpoints or the pro-Brexit viewpoints are very limited and certainly aren't watched by the vast majority of the nation. So I hope that this discussion gets as wide an audience as possible, so people are now equipped with the full arsenal of weapons with which to rebut the claims when they next encounter them. And I would encourage all of our viewers to please share this as widely as possible. We need to get the message out that Brexit has not been a catastrophe. Far from it. There are many great positives to celebrate. And also, we've proven that actually the joke is wrong. We've managed to find two economists that actually do agree on a single issue. So well done to both of you. Laurels will be in the post coming along. Thanks very much for your time today. Greatly appreciate. Hope we'll see you again at some point in the future. That's all for now, but please do join us if you are an NCF member. We're going to be asking you a couple more questions on more wide and broader issues in our exclusive member-only content segment. If you want to become a member, you'll get a huge range of perks, so please do join. We can't do what we do without your support. You'll find the link below or on our website. In the meantime, I'm Rafe Hadel-Manku, and I'll see you next time. Hello, I'm Rafe Hadel-Manku, and on behalf of the New Culture Forum, I'm delighted to launch a series of free walking tours and historic visits around London and around Britain. If you like your commentary, unwoke, positive and upbeat, this is for you. And if you like your history to unabashedly celebrate the very greatest achievements of Britain, its history and its heroes, then I hope you will consider coming along on one of our tours. I'll show you secret corners, hidden treasures, and other curiosities that millions of people walk past without noticing, such as these air raid shelter ghost signs on a street near our offices at the New Culture Forum. We'll celebrate some of Britain's greatest achievements. Behind me is the Buxton Memorial Fountain, erected to commemorate those brave British abolitionists who campaigned successfully for the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. And we'll dispel the ridiculous new myths that the left are creating about some of our finest heroes, people like Lawrence of Arabia, who lived in the house just behind me. But there's a catch. To join one of our tours, you need to be a signed-up member of the New Culture Forum. From as little as £4 a month, you can receive a range of exclusive perks and benefits. At the lower tiers, this includes exclusive content, discounted tickets to our lectures, our conferences, our literary festival, and much more besides. At the upper tier levels, this includes many things such as invitations to private events, a chance to meet the NCF team, and of course to attend many events in our studios. So please do consider joining either via the link below or our website, newcultureforum.org.uk.